Ooh, I have a little clock. That's good.
Thank you for anointing me. That's what I did here.
Why you put it on there?
I got it closer. I like it.
"6:57. Are you getting excited?" I'm watching the little clock. Yes. Good evening, everybody. It's great to see you all back again this week. This is the second evening we're meeting to talk about the spirituality of Dorothy Day, and it's great fun to see people back again this week. I hope that you found, as I did this past week, praying more consciously with Dorothy Day's spirit of gratitude and praise, and that hunger to grow in freedom for the love of God that calls us to let go of lesser goods, right? Any lesser love, let those take the place that they're supposed to, second place, so that all of our love can be more freely given to God. So last week, I told you the story of Dorothy Day's conversion, and I was trying to let you in the course of that, because I think Dorothy Day is widely perceived as social activist and as a very political figure and a very controversial figure, and for good reason. But then when we think about her that way, we miss this other part of her, the role of beauty in her life, and this profound longing for God through all of her life. This longing for God that she saw in herself, and that she saw also in other people, and in fact in the whole of society. Oops. Sorry, I'm having a little technical difficulty. Could I get an assist on?
Is that right? Turned down last time here.
There we go.
That should do it.
The rule is turn it on first. Okay. Well, it lit up for a second, and then it went off again. That's off. That's off.
Should be on. Sorry, just
No, it's all right.
Can you help with it? It's not.
I wanted you to see a picture of Dorothy's face while we're talking about this, but I can happily keep talking while we work on that. Yeah. So I want to, as we're thinking about that practice of love and gratitude, paying attention to the role of beauty in Dorothy's life, and all of this, as she tells a story, being caught up in the soul's longing for God and in the world's longing for God, right? That's this long loneliness, not just of the individual, but of the whole world for communion with God. I want to remind you that this practice of sowing the natural goods, it's not about demonstrating our self-control or feeling any shame about the pleasure that we take in the goods of the world, things that we enjoy, that we desire. It's good and right to enjoy those things. What this practice of sowing is about is learning, with the help of grace, to love God better, to be more free in our ability to love God with all of our hearts and minds and souls. So what I want to switch to this week is talking about, what I want to talk about this week is the work that Dorothy Day did for nearly 50 years. Nope. Okay, sorry, I was pausing to try to get a picture. The work that Dorothy Day did for nearly 50 years, so the Catholic worker started, she met Peter Morin in 1932. In 1933, they started this newspaper. She died in 1980. For the nearly 50 years in there, she was engaged every day in work that was very emotionally and very physically taxing, work that put her right in the midst of the world's suffering. So I want to pay attention to that work that she was doing, but I want to do that in a way that reflects this spirit of gratitude and of desire for God above all. How did she do this? Right? How did she live in the midst of poverty and controversy and political strife as someone who was constantly grateful to God, right? Deo gratias, the words on her tombstone. Well, I mentioned last week that a few years after her conversion to Catholicism, Dorothy Day made an earnest prayer that a way would open up for her as a Catholic to work with and for people in poverty, to work with the workers. This is early in the Depression, and the desperation of people is extreme. And she didn't know how, as a Catholic, to participate in that. At that period of time, the movements she had been involved with, the radical movements that she had been involved with, because they were connected to atheism, meant she couldn't be involved in those as a Catholic. She had cut those ties. So what would be her place? How could she, someone who was so much about love of other people, about the communion of humanity, what was going to be the role that she could play? So, can I hand you this? And you could maybe try. Yeah, okay, that's fine. So the answer to her prayer. Oh my goodness, there it was. That's Dorothy's face that we've been talking about all along. So she made this earnest prayer, and as I said, be careful what you pray for. She got home from making that prayer, and Peter Morin was waiting for her there. So let me tell you a little bit more about Peter Morin, because this is the man who taught Dorothy Day how to see that Catholicism had an answer to not only her personal disorder, she knew that, but also to the social disorder that they were living through. In fact, he argued Catholicism had a better answer than communism did, and this was the message he wanted to get out. So Peter Morin. Peter grew up in a big peasant family in France. He was born in the 1870s. He trained to be a Salesian brother and a teacher, but when he was still a very young man, France suppressed the Catholic teaching orders, and so he had to leave that. He joined a social movement in France. That fell apart. He left France to start again homesteading in Saskatchewan. This is how he came to the Americas, homesteading in Canada. His homesteading partner was killed in an accident, though, so Peter became a traveling manual laborer. We're in the beginning of the 20th century now. He was riding the rails, moving from one manual labor job to another. He was a hobo. He was arrested as a vagrant. He slept rough, as many people did, because the wages just weren't sufficient to get housing. He knew what it was like to do the work and then be told, take the train into town and they'll pay you there, and to get into town and not be given his wages. He knew very well what the struggle of the worker was in this era. He lived that way for 20 years. He was eventually, though, able to settle in Chicago and earn a living as a French teacher. He's a native French speaker. Now, Peter didn't like to talk about himself. He loved to talk. He talked a lot, but he didn't talk much about himself. All he said was that he realized at a certain point in Chicago that he was not living a good Christian life. He had some kind of renewed conversion that had something to do with St. Francis of Assisi. And he abandoned his wealth and began living in voluntary poverty. He eventually found work as a caretaker at a camp in New York, and he could live there at the camp, tend to the place, and had access to a library. And he read, and he read, and he read. And as he read sources about history, about economics, about political theory, about Catholic theology, he read papal writings, lives of the saints. As he read all of this, he developed what he called a synthesis, a way of understanding what had happened in the world, what was going wrong, why there was such disorder. And he had a vision of what was possible to do out of this, and he developed a plan of action. Very practical man. He wasn't an idealist off in the sky. He wanted to see things done. So key to this plan was he believed in direct action, the action of people in their communities, people like you and me, regular people in their communities, using their own good sense, using their own creativity and their skills, acting at a personal sacrifice to make something new present. He wasn't interested in getting a new political party in place. He borrowed from the radicals of his time a phrase that they liked to use, that he was about building a new society within the shell of the old. So not a revolution that would replace the dominant system, but building within, right? As there is disorder out there, we build cells of good living, places where we're experimenting with doing something different. So here's a little bit of Peter's writing. He was trained to be a teacher. He knew, keep it short, keep it repetitive, keep it punchy. That's how you teach. So he said, people say, they don't do this, they don't do that. They ought to do this, they ought to do that. It's always they and never I. People should say, they are crazy for doing this and not doing that. But I don't need to be crazy the way they are crazy. The communitarian revolution is basically a personal revolution. It starts with I and not they. One I plus one I makes two I's, and two I's makes a we. We is a community, while they is just a crowd. So he was about building community for action. Now, when he met Dorothy Day, he had this great synthesis in his mind, right? And he was looking for a partner, somebody to help him with this. And he knew that Dorothy Day was a writer, a journalist. So he wanted her to start a newspaper to spread his ideas. And she said, always the sensible one, how are we going to pay for that? And he said, haven't you read the lives of the saints? Don't worry about that. We just do the thing that God has given us to do, and the money will come. So she didn't pay her own bills for a month, and they put out a newspaper, and the rest is history, right? They paid the printer, and she put her other bills off. This is direct action at a personal sacrifice. One I met another I, and they did what they could with what they had at hand. So this is what the newspaper looks like, the Catholic Worker that they started. It sold and still does sell for a penny a copy. You can send them a donation with a request to be on the distribution list, and you will get the paper forever. They took them out into the streets. They sold them on street corners. They were competing with the newspapers that Dorothy Day used to work for before her conversion, right? The radical papers that were out there selling to the workers. And as people read this paper, people started turning up at Dorothy's door, coming to them, both people who were in need of help and people who wanted to join in the work. And oftentimes those two groups are not mutually exclusive. The people who needed help also wanted to join in the work. The people who wanted to join in the work often also needed help as well. It was the Depression. There was a lot of poverty going around. So she and Peter started putting into practice what they had written. They opened places for people to stay out of their own resources, shared their own homes, used their own incomes. And this was about meeting emergency needs. As I said, in the Depression, this is the urgent need. But people in need were never, for Dorothy Day or for Peter Morin, never just needy, right? They didn't look at people and see, wow, there's a poor person. People aren't defined by what they don't have. People have personalities, they have talents, they have ideas. Dorothy's writing is full of stories, funny stories, heartbreaking stories about specific people and their families and their talents and their loves and their suffering. Many of the people who came to them in need became the early family of the Catholic Worker. So this is an image from the New York Worker. It's 1967, so it's not as old as all that, but black and white, it still looks old to us, right? This offering hospitality to people in need, this was the first step of Peter Morin's plan of action. His program started with houses of hospitality. He said in the medieval era, Christianity had houses of hospitality all over Europe for people. This is the origin of hospitals. I don't know if you ever think about hospitals and hospitality, the words being connected, right? The tradition was guest houses for people in need. Now, they didn't have a lot of fancy medical care. What they did have was a recognition that they were supposed to welcome the stranger. They were supposed to offer care for people who were in need. So this is an expression of the commitment that Jesus taught us to have, to welcome the stranger. And that welcome meant, as Peter Morin intended to practice it, certainly as Dorothy practiced it, as has become characteristic of the Catholic worker, that people become part of the family. The typical focus that Peter and Dorothy developed was on not seeing people in need as a collection of problems to be solved, but seeing them as people. There's a story Dorothy would tell sometimes about a woman who came in one day with a lot of problems, and she was immediately surrounded by people who wanted to help her, people who were getting her clothes, and people who were going to see to her medical issues, and people who were trying to do something about her housing, and people who were going to look at her shoes. And they were also busy running around, and somebody looked down and saw the woman sitting there at the table crying. And she said, "I just wanted somebody to have a cup of tea with me." So this is a very important part of the character of the work that Dorothy Day did. There are problems that need to be worked out, a lot of practical problems that need to be worked out, but the trick was always keeping the person as the first order. A person becomes a part of the family, not a problem to be solved, but a member of the family. And as Dorothy said, they come to us and they stay with us until they die. The rest of the family then will bury them and pray for their souls after they're gone. So practicing this kind of hospitality, Dorothy simply and directly and repeatedly refused the distinction between the deserving and the undeserving poor. She would say, Christ didn't say, give to all who ask of you as long as they make responsible and productive use of what you give them, or as long as they have good hygiene, or as long as they submit to the right professionals telling them how to sort their lives out. The Christian call is to welcome the stranger. And these houses of hospitality made, and still, I would say, make space for human beings at moments that they don't easily fit into other places. As Peter might say, in a society that's this upside down, who wants to be normal anyway? Now, of course, there are public resources, there are state structures that assist people in need. Dorothy was often critical of those facilities for their impersonality, for the way that they sort of warehoused people in need instead of treating them as fellow humans or as family members. But she did also understand the role of those places. She understood that people sometimes prefer not to be treated personally. There's a shame in having to ask for help, and people would go someplace where they didn't have to be engaged personally as a way to save their pride. Now, Dorothy never stopped demanding that we pay attention to the things that cause poverty: bad wages, the lack of health care, the need to support child raising, discrimination, legal structures that favor concentration of wealth rather than small ownership, war. In all of her defense of personal hospitality at a personal sacrifice to everyone who comes, she was not implying that the answer was simply for the state to leave social services to individuals and churches and otherwise go on as it is. I sometimes hear people talk about Dorothy Day as though that's what she meant, as though she's a libertarian, right? A person who wanted social services completely removed from the government. And I think that's a profound misunderstanding of her. She was about what Catholic teaching calls subsidiarity. It's a big word. It just means allow people to take responsibility for what they can at the local level. People can do things with their own hands in their own communities more effectively, more prudently in many cases. But you also have to organize broader structures to help deal with matters that an individual or a local community can't manage. We'll come back to this business. So this form of life, this practice of houses of hospitality, this continues. I would say every Catholic worker house is different. Everyone has their own way of practicing hospitality because this is one I meets another I, where are we, what can we do? So people do this in their own way, what's possible for them, what works in their situation, and what they judge is right. Some communities are much larger, some are much smaller, some have lots of rules, some have no rules at all. There's no organization, there's no bylaws. Peter said it's not an organization, it's an organism. Basically, the rule is if you're crazy enough to want to hang out a sign and say you're a Catholic worker, you go do it. Right? There are certainly networks of Catholic workers in touch with each other, newspapers that get put out, arguments that go on among different Catholic workers about certain kinds of issues, how they ought to address some things. But in keeping with Peter's vision, the rule is do it yourself as you can with the people who are around you. So you can already see something about what's helping Dorothy Day to do this for 50 years. It's simply about the work that you can do with the people in front of you, not about a grand scheme that you're trying to address. It's the belief that what we do here and now has power. It matters. There's another one. I really like that photo of the from the South Bend Catholic worker. So Peter's vision was not just about the House of Hospitality. As I said, this was one of the steps in his program. Another one of them was, he called it roundtable discussions for the clarification of thought. He loved big words, man, things that could roll off the tongue like that. This was organizing people together for discussion and for mutual education, to listen to each other and learn from each other. He loved to go out on the street and round up people who had all kinds of different political convictions and bring them back to the house and sit them down and have a big conversation. He believed in the power of people meeting together to come to understanding, to come to insight, to find ways to act effectively. He was also about developing new forms of economic cooperation, and a key to the combination of these things, this sort of education discussion and new forms of economic activity, was what he called agronomic universities. Like I say, Peter, love the big words. We might call these farms. That's what they're usually called, Catholic worker farms. These were farms where, as Peter designed it, workers, especially unemployed workers who needed work, could come to a farm and have work to do because there's always work on the land. And scholars would come to the farms because they had big ideas up in their heads and didn't know which way was up and didn't understand what was actually happening. And the scholars and the workers can live together at the farm. They work through the morning on the farm work. In the afternoon, the scholars come in and lead discussions and study of topics that can help people to have a bigger picture, to develop something like this synthesis that Peter Morin had developed about history, about economics, about culture, about theology. Dorothy Day said, this is very typical of Peter, when she looked at his schedule for his ideal life on the farm, and she was like, when do we do laundry? Who's taking care of the children? He was, in some senses, very practical, but he really had in mind this sort of, there would be workers and there would be scholars and they would discuss, and this would be a great life. So his idea, his vision here was you provide work for the unemployed, you build community, and you create scholarship that is more useful, more creative, because it's confronted with the actual problems that people are living through in the world, right? I know this as a scholar. There's nothing more disturbing than being asked a question by somebody who has to actually live out the things that I talk about, because they know where the real difficulties are, right? You make scholars do much better work if you make them live with workers. Now, Peter also held that life on the land is good for families and good for the faith. Remember, he grew up in a peasant family in a peasant village, gathered around a practice of the faith that was connected to the seasons of the year, the natural cycles. And he held that this kind of work, hard work where you have personal responsibility, where you are contributing to the good of other people, you're producing things that other people need, he held that this was good for society, good for people, and that starting these farms was a way to build that society in which it is easier to be good, build up the new within the shell of the old. Now, these farms, like the House of Hospitality, continue to exist. This is the main garden at what's called the Peter Morin Farm now in Marlborough, New York, which is connected to the New York Catholic worker. So it's Tom and Monica Cornell, much beloved leaders in the Catholic worker movement on their porch at the Peter Moran farm. But there are, in fact, Catholic worker farms all over the country. Now, the farms have been difficult because, as you may imagine, when you get unemployed urban workers and scholars together and put them on a farm, the problem is nobody actually knows how to farm. So the farms have had mixed success. Some have done better, some have done worse, some seasons better, some worse. But the farms have the possibility of having a place on the land for study, for prayer, for work, for building community. This has always been an important part of the worker, and it really has been revived in recent years because of people's increased environmental consciousness and concern about climate change, and because we're so aware that developing sustainable ways to produce food locally is so important to our economic and ecological reality right now. So these practices of Catholic worker farms, in fact, are still alive and kicking, all the difficulties they've had notwithstanding. In fact, they are more vibrant than ever. And this approach that Peter brought to the farms, whatever we say about his idea of how the schedule would work and who would staff farms, this idea he had that this is basically about getting people together and telling them, you can do something. You can do this. Let's put some people together and figure out how to make it happen. Do it at a personal sacrifice. You don't have to find funding from someplace else. Do it in a spirit of voluntary poverty. Do it for love of one another. And that approach has made possible experiments, right? A lot of these Catholic worker farms really have been sort of experiments in truth, attempts to live into a new way, and we learn from the mistakes of those attempts. They've been places where we've developed a new awareness of what good work could look like, of what good community could look like, what good food could look like, by the way. So Dorothy Day set up shop in the midst of humanity, in the midst of people suffering poverty in the industrial economy, people suffering from racism, people suffering from violence, in places that often had little obvious natural beauty, not much fresh air, cramped rooms smelling of poverty. She was working with people who had been, in many cases, just ground down by a lifelong struggle to get ahead in a world that stacked against them. When she was writing, she was covering stories of long-running labor struggles, sometimes stories of wars in which Christians were blowing each other up, as in the case of World War II. Day after day, she did the work. They always say a lot of it is just, what is it, 90% is just showing up, right? She did the work. You organize and you prepare food, help people meet their medical needs, their housing, help people find work, write articles, lay out the paper, get it mailed out to the mailing list, accept requests to speak at churches and at schools, attending meetings with other people trying to do the work, showing up at protests. She did this day after day and continued to teach and practice through it all that the first principle, the essential thing in all of it, is growing in the love of God. And this means frequent prayer. Dorothy attended daily Mass and weekly confession herself. I think this prayer anchored her in a reality that everything is grace. We're all guests in God's house of hospitality, if you want to put it that way. And God makes room for us. We are strange guests. We are not very cooperative guests. We don't follow the approved program for making our lives better. And yet God makes space for us, for all of us. And so it all rounds back into gratitude and praise and an increased love of God. This is one of those images that's particularly associated with the Catholic worker. The artist is Fritz Eichenberg, and I've used a few of his other woodcuts, I think, in these slideshows. But if you're wondering about the artist, Fritz Eichenberg, this is Christ of the Soup Line. This prayer life of Dorothy's, she said when she traveled, there were only two things she always took with her on a trip: a jar of instant coffee and her breviary, so she could pray the Liturgy of the Hours on the road. That kind of prayer, that dedication daily to prayer, is a sort of a leaven in her life that allows her to keep struggling to see Christ in others, especially in those in whom he is most difficult to recognize. She would speak sometimes about Christ in his most distressing disguise. But at the center of her work, as at the center of her life, is not anger or sorrow. It's reverence toward everything that God is doing in the world, particularly what God is doing in the human soul, which is made in God's image. I love this as an image of the Catholic worker. There they are, people made in the image and likeness of God. And you could say these are people in need, but these are clearly not just people in need. These are human beings, right, finding their way through life. Now, Peter Morin called this approach, the basic philosophy that he taught Dorothy Day and that imbues the Catholic worker, he called this personalism. So personalism is a philosophical movement, but don't get scared. I'm going to talk philosophy for just a minute. You're not going to get lost. This is pretty simple, pretty basic. It goes like this. So Peter's living in 19th, early 20th century European thought, right? Now, there were some European philosophers who had argued that the movement of reality is really the working out of this great spirit. And there are kind of great ideas that sweep through time. So you can walk through history and say, at this point, this was the great idea, and then another great idea came along, and then another one, and we're gradually learning through these great ideas. And that's what's propelling human history forward, with the idea kind of, this is the Spirit of God at work in the world. This is how God works, through these great ideas that are propelling history forward. Now, there were another set of philosophers who came along and said, that's poppycock. What makes things happen is the way people organize material stuff. Who's got the money? And who's using their money to do what stuff? How do we set up society so that some people get power and other people don't get power? And the way those things are set up, that's what shapes our understanding of the world, and it shapes our ideas. And as we change those things, other pieces follow after them. But what's really driving everything is the struggle of people against each other for power, for resources, for control over their lives. That's really the thing that's moving history. Okay, so those are two options. We can call one of them idealism and the other one materialism if you want. You don't have to bother about that. But Peter bought into this philosophy that said, no. It's neither these great historical ideas, nor is it like just the push and pull and shove of power and material wealth. The thing that's really moving society is the human person made in the image and likeness of God, who has these like astounding depths and is so full of surprises and creativity. That's the great power in the world. That's what we need to be paying attention to. That's where the energy comes from that makes things better and worse in the world. God working in the human soul. So this is what Peter meant by Christian personalism. You may, if you're into this kind of thing, you may know John Paul II was also very influenced by personalist philosophy. So as Peter understood this, this means every person. I'm looking at every person who's here in the room with me. I'm looking at everybody who's online somewhere, kind of, if you're over there. Every person has unique power and importance. Dorothy Day said when she met Peter, aside from sort of his babbling on and on about all his ideas that he wanted her to write in the paper, the other thing that struck her was he made you feel like you were a great soul, like you were capable of important things, because he believed that. He believed that's the way God has made us, that we are capable of extraordinary things, each and every one of us in our own ways. And this person, when we talk about personalism and we're talking about a focus on the person, to be very clear, we're not talking about the individual. That's it's a really important difference between these two terms. So in Catholic thought, when we talk about the person, we're talking about a person who's born into a family, who's called into a community of faith, who's called into the communion of saints, in fact, who is part of the family of humanity and is a brother and sister of Christ. And so the person is always in relationship. There's no way you could imagine, Catholic thought would say, you can't imagine Kelly Johnson without talking about the University of Dayton and the city of Dayton and the city I grew up in and the family I grew up in and the friendships that have guided me through my whole life. Because the person I am is tied up in those relationships, right? We're not individuals, we are people in relationships. So Peter was convinced. The solution, this is the answer to the big synthesis. The solution is this turn to the person, right? It's all about recognizing the dignity and the beauty and the power of the person. So one way this worked out in the practice of the Catholic worker was the works of mercy. So Dorothy practiced the works of mercy. These are those things we find in Matthew 25, right? To feed those who are hungry, give drink to the thirsty, clothing to those who are naked, to welcome the stranger, to visit the imprisoned, care for the sick, bury the dead. Peter's teaching drew together a community of people that was built around those works of mercy as a daily practice to care for each other, always knowing that that other, this is the mysterious depth of the person, that other is an other Christ, right? This isn't just that we're all so great, it's that the depth of the mystery of who I am is Christ. This is the depth of the mystery of who each of you is as well. So this is central to Catholic worker practice, is doing the works of mercy daily at a personal sacrifice for the love of God. And this often does involve sowing your own will, the things that you would like to be doing with your time, the settings that would be more comfortable for you, the food that you would prefer to eat. Not because it's bad to want nicer things, but to sow those so that you are more free to love God by practicing the works of mercy. Oh, one of the phrases that Dorothy returned to year after year in her work, one of the sort of catchphrases was the primacy of the spiritual. One time they wrote this in the newspaper. It was I think it was a headline. Anyway, it was written in the newspaper, and at the last minute, the printer saw it about to go to press and thought, oh, that's a typo, and changed it to the privacy of the spiritual instead of the primacy of the spiritual, because he assumed that's what it had to mean. I mean, I think that's very typical of us in our culture to think that the spiritual must be private. And so we approach something like this when you see the works of mercy being carried on as though they are kind of private. At least they're not political. They're sort of individual acts of charity, not anything economic, not anything social, not anything political. But I'll tell you, that is not what Dorothy Day thought they were doing. That is emphatically not the way she understood what they were doing. She understood primacy of the spiritual to mean the human struggle is, that human struggle, that same human struggle we meet in everybody we meet who is in need, including ourselves, that struggle for food and for clothing and for decent work, that struggle is always fundamentally about our longing for God. Our economic problems and our political problems and our social problems, they are all ultimately about our longing for God. They're ultimately spiritual problems. So the whole aim of this movement, doing the works of mercy daily, is not about the fulfillment of an individual or a denomination, but the fulfillment of humanity by practicing the love of God. I mean, it meets immediate needs, but the works of mercy have a much bigger scope This is what I'm trying to express. In fact, for the Catholic worker, the works of mercy are the basic model of an economy in which it is easier to be good. As they thought about it, as Peter thinks about it, and he gets this from Catholic social teaching, the economy exists to meet human needs. I don't know what we think the economy means, but the economy is a way that we're meeting human needs. That's what it's for. And so, as Peter saw it, that means the economy is an outgrowth of the works of mercy, right? Everything we do in the economy is another way to give drink to the thirsty, to give food to the hungry, to give clothes to the people who need clothing, to take care of each other's needs. That's what an economy does. So we want to switch the picture. Instead of picturing there's sort of the economy where everything, serious economic happens, and then out around the edges there's the works of mercy, and that's this kind of peripheral thing. Peter taught Dorothy to flip that picture entirely. The center of it is the works of mercy. And all of the work we do is just an elaboration of that. Another way to love our neighbor, another way then to love Christ in our neighbor. And if that's not what our economy is, well, he would say, this is the job of Catholics, to get together and to demonstrate how to do it. Get together with your friends, find a way to prove that that is what an economy should be and what it can be. I mean, this was not at all just about a dreamy wish that everybody would be nice to each other. When Dorothy and Peter talked about their revolution, right, the way they were trying to build a new society within the shell of the old, to make a society in which it is easier to be good, they were drawing on Catholic teaching, particularly the idea that private property is a good arrangement. Having private property is a pretty good arrangement, as long as it gives responsibility and creativity to people. Which is to say, private property should be widely distributed. The preference would be that we organize private property in such a way that lots of people have private property, so that whatever else we're doing, everybody's needs are being met, and people have a way to do work that they are responsible for, that they can be creative, so that they can be giving a gift with their labor, so that their labor can also be part of the works of mercy. If you want to know more about that, there's a whole theory they're drawing on, the economic theory distributism, which has, again, recently been kind of revived. There's some new scholarship around that. But distributism claimed that economic stability comes from a society in which fewer people are dependent on wages, in which the basis of society is widespread small ownership. So that kind of approach, this way of thinking about the works of mercy as the center and an economy then that builds out around them, led Peter and Dorothy, Catholic workers after them, to think about promoting cooperative businesses where the workers are also owners. Those of you who are in Dayton, you know about the Gem City Market probably. This has been a big deal in Dayton in recent years. A worker-owned and community-owned business so that the community in West Dayton has control of the store themselves. Now that's not easy. That means they have to make the hard decisions. They have to deal with the problems that come up. But it's theirs. This is a way of honoring what Peter's talking about, this mysterious depth of the human person in which God is working, to give people a sense of their own responsibility and creativity. There is, in fact, a whole Catholic tradition about cooperative businesses. There's an internationally successful cooperative business, the Mondragon Corporation, that began in Spain under the leadership of a priest who'd been inspired by Catholic social teaching. It's a model for a lot of cooperative movements. I was just today on a call with a number of people involved in a thing called the Economy of Francesco. Pope Francis started this in 2019. He called together creative economic thinkers and social entrepreneurs and small business people from around the world to meet in Assisi in 2019 to talk about how to develop a new kind of economy, a human economy that was good for the earth and good for humanity. These things are happening, and Catholics are in the midst of it, including, still on the call I was on today, a number of people from Catholic worker communities who identify this as part of their mission. This kind of thing can also be, I thought this was entertaining, one of the models Peter had was cottage industry. Again, you and your friends get together, start a business, figure out what you can do locally with the little you have. So how can you begin to do some craft work, something with your hands, something that requires skill, something that involves your own creativity and personality in producing something which is good for other people to have? So this kind of personalism shapes the daily life of the worker and the methods that Day is engaging in all those years. They are attempting this revolution that centers the human person as beloved by God and as an actor, an agent. The human person is not just a passive recipient. The work of grace in us is to bring us out there to do stuff in the world. Every person, as I said, is Christ, even the person who is disruptive. Now, the Catholic worker doesn't generally try to fix people. They just make room for people to be loved as they are and to discover what it is that their personality is bringing, what it is that God is doing in this person. This is a way of building cells of good living, local communities where people discover that they have power when they connect to others to make something different. Okay, well, that's a lot of talk about theories and things, although I hope it fires your imagination with ways that our spirituality isn't just something we do in a quiet room by ourselves or in a space like this, as good and as important as that practice is. What Dorothy and Peter showed was when you're driven by this discipline of loving God, of hungering for God in the encounter with other people in all things in the world, then you can explore, be brave, be bold in finding new ways to live in this disordered society. We have a mission for the good of the world, to show the world that it doesn't have to be this way. There are other ways we can organize ourselves. So one of the stories that I love about Dorothy that I think illustrates something important about the way she practiced this personalism. Somebody at one point came to the Catholic worker. People would bring donations down, right? Somebody came and donated a diamond ring. So it was given to Dorothy, and people were walking around all day watching her thinking, what is she going to do with it, right? What's she going to do with the diamond ring? And so late in the day, she approached one of the older women who lived in the house. I call her a bag lady, a woman who lived in the street, and gave her the diamond ring. And in a scene somewhat reminiscent of the scriptures, Dorothy's disciples came to her and said, what are you doing giving that away? We could have sold that and gotten money enough to feed people for a month. We're always short on cash. We could have done so much good with that. And she said, the woman has her dignity. If she wants to sell the ring, she can sell the ring. But God didn't just make diamonds for the rich. So here's this way of working, right? There's a temptation to want to find a way to fix things, to get control of things, to fix people, to get a political party together that can make your will be done, to get enough wealth together that you can buy people into your approach. And this is not what Dorothy and Peter did, because they held the thing that matters, the thing that makes the world move, is the action of grace in the human soul. So what do you do with the diamond? Honor the human soul, right? That's the priority. Now, this is incredibly inefficient. I don't think efficiency is a bad thing on the whole. I think where we can be efficient, that is definitely good. But it's very clear at the worker, efficiency comes way down the list of goods, far behind honoring the human person, right? In whatever way that takes. Okay, so Dorothy was living in the midst of the world's injustice and violence and suffering, and her solution was not to build a militia, although I think she might have been tempted some days, not even to organize a voting bloc. She offered personal witness at a personal sacrifice to rouse the conscience of others to act in a similar way. And because she had a persuasive message, because she was living it, she touched people all over the world. I mean, this seems to be a very small and very ineffective way to work. And yet the subscription to the Catholic Worker, when people found out what they were doing, caught this message, realized that people were living this way and they were inviting other people to live this way, they had an enormous impact, far outweighing the numbers of people who were actually involved in the movement. Now, I think we can say that, looking back on it, that they had that kind of effect. I think day to day, it is very hard to sustain. When you're in the midst of that kind of work, and we know this, day to day in our own lives, you're just trying to push through all the stuff that's coming at you. How do you sustain attention to the love of God? Patience with the whacked out, crazy human beings that God has given you to love as your neighbors and brothers and sisters and strangers and enemies. How do you sustain that? Especially when you're someone like Dorothy Day who recognizes that injustice is built into the social system and that there are large structures, very hard structures to move, that are, in Reverend Bill Barber's words, they're hurting the people you love. So there's this urgency, there's an outrage at the state of the world. I've been told that one time somebody said to Dorothy Day she needed to hold her temper, because she did have quite a temper, needed to hold her temper, and she said, "I hold my temper more in 5 minutes than you've held yours in your entire life." She was angry, and she had reason to be angry. And she channeled that anger into greater love for human persons, day after day. This was not easy for her. It's not like this just magically happened. You just show up and do this day after day, practicing the works of mercy, both the corporal ones, the physical ones, right? Feeding the hungry, clothing the naked, visiting those who are in prison, and also the spiritual works of mercy, like instructing the ignorant and admonishing the sinner, other works of mercy that she was very fond of. But I think in honor of October 1st, I think even if it weren't October 1st, I would say this, but happy feast day of Therese of Lisieux, I have to point out that a very important part of Dorothy's spirituality and the way she handled living with these vast, huge problems that she was constantly aware of, so frustrating, living in that environment without becoming bitter, without despair, without letting her anger drive her to hatred. The spiritual practice she drew on was Therese of Lisieux's little way. Dorothy said when a priest first gave her Therese's writings that she thought it was like pious pap. It was just saccharine. It was not at all interesting. But she eventually came to see, she said, that Therese is exactly the saint we need now. I want to read you just a little bit of this. She said, "With governments growing stronger and more centralized, the common person feels ineffective. When the whole world seems given over to preparedness for war and the show of force, the message of Therese is quite a different one. She speaks to our condition. Is the atom a little thing? And yet what havoc it has wrought. Is her little way a small contribution to the life of the Spirit? It has all the power of the spirit of Christianity behind it. It is an explosive force that can transform our lives and the life of the world once put into effect." Therese, wanted to do really great things, great things with her life. And she came to understand, Therese came to understand, that in God's hands, the small things she did were not small at all. To do everything for the love of God, sacrificing herself, even hidden away in a cloister in France, those things had power. And Dorothy Day knew that the work she did, as different as it was from Therese, was also tiny, tiny relative to the problems that she was faced with. But she knew as well to do this work for the love of God has enormous power. So don't be afraid to be small. Don't be afraid to be small, even in the face of what is large. Now, I have to mention at this point that all of this for Day is connected to another commitment she had that I think is also part of the picture we have to put together of how she kept practicing day after day this faith, this longing for God over so many years. And that is her commitment to pacifism. As I said, Dorothy Day got angry a lot. She had lots of people to be annoyed with, lots of reasons to be annoyed. But she had read in the scriptures that when someone strikes you, you should turn the other cheek, that she was called to love enemies, to respond to evil by doing good to those who did the evil. And so she had a commitment to pacifism. She held that that was binding. Christ's words were binding on Christians, and that war could not be compatible with a call to take up the cross. So building this personalism, building the new within the shell of the old, the works of mercy, the little way, these were for her all ways she could live in a world of violence and not feel out of power. I mean, I think this is what happens, right? We see so much terrible stuff happening, and we have to do something. And so our good instinct to want to fight what's wrong leads us to violence. The path Dorothy laid out was a path to let her, with her anger, her outrage at how the world was structured, to act with courage and boldness and to push herself to do something that was hard, but to do something that was in every way she could possibly manage it, giving up the desire to manipulate another person, to control, to demand other people, to offer a witness, to care, to offer support, but not to try to control them. This is her life of sowing, right? She's sowing at every turn the goods that she would choose for herself so that she can only pursue in perfect freedom this good of the love of God. Okay, so I'm coming to the end here, and I wanted to end with one other phrase that I think is very important to Dorothy's spirituality and how she managed for nearly 50 years to keep doing this kind of stuff. And that is the duty of delight. The duty of delight. I mean, I hope you remember from last week that Dorothy's life is so much about the love of beauty. And she could see beauty in the midst of situations that we would not conventionally call pretty places or peaceful places. And yet she would see the way the light falls there, right? The beauty of a particular face, the shape of a building, of some trace of human work that was good and beautiful, that she could see in any place some kind of beauty. And she held, we are made for joy. We live in this world that is God's house of hospitality, and it is made to be a good place for us. So when we get obsessed with our checklist and the things that we need to get done, because we got to fix so much stuff because there's so much wrong, and we need to make things right, and we've got, this is me, I'm talking, those of you who are type A's out there, I'm speaking to you. So you got your long list of things you got to do, you've got all your duties stacked up. You want to put in your list of all your duties stacked up the duty of delight. Part of our obligation as human beings is to take time to see the beauty and to take joy and to be grateful to God for the lives that we've been given and for the lives of those around us who make our world. This is, of course, Dorothy taking time to be with her grandchildren. She did take time away from the house of hospitality. She would sometimes bail and stay with her daughter. She took a sabbatical year at one point away from the community because she needed some time to pull herself back together, to heal her soul, to find her way again. It is important to be sure that we're not losing our sense of joy in the midst of whatever we're doing. See, she does smile. Once in a while, you can find a picture of Dorothy smiling. So I hope that all of this I've talked about tonight, these sort of glimpses into the way Dorothy navigated those years of her work. I hope this gives you a sense of the spirituality of reverence and praise and gratitude and trust and obedience that is also about delight in God's goodness and is about attention to the things that cause poverty, the things that degrade human beings. Not turning away from those things because they're too big or because we think they're not spiritual. They are spiritual problems. And God has given us the ability to confront them. Right? So I hope that you can take away from this an invitation into prayer to achieve the primacy of the spiritual and not the privacy of the spiritual, and that you'll find in the path of Dorothy, as I have, new avenues into the love of God. So thank you. We do have a microphone set up here if people have comments or questions. I'd love to talk with you some about what you're thinking. Peter Morin believes that in the depths of your soul you have wisdom and creativity.
So I'm always struck by, the good that an individual person can do. You mentioned locally, Gym City Market.
Yeah.
We know there's lots of good activities out there, House of Bread, Shoes for the Shoeless, and things like that. And, those are small things and they make a difference. And the thing that always strikes me is that, it would take a lot of that to solve all the problems. But what could really help is if people didn't make the problems worse. Like if you're not going to do that, understand, but at least don't make the problem worse, because then everybody who's trying to help has to work even that much harder. So anyway, I don't know if that was something that she thought about or if you had any comments on that.
Wow, that's interesting. I don't know. So help me think about this. The things that people do that make it worse. Are you thinking about something specific?
Well, you talked a little bit about Gym City Market. So, part of the reason why that's a problem is because grocery stores moved out of those areas. Yeah. So maybe if they had just said, okay, well, we're not going to make a huge profit, but we're going to stay here because of this or that, or, just something like that. Or, even we talk a lot about misinformation, fear of refugees, all these things. If you don't want to house the refugee, fine, but at least don't say, they're rapists and murderers and they're bringing in COVID and they're trying to change us to a Islamic Republic, or, all these other things that you see online that, make it harder for the people who are trying to do the right thing to do that right thing.
Yeah, one thing that occurs to me about that, I think this is important to keep in mind, that that the works of mercy are very important in Dorothy Day, that she understood the works of mercy to be about an economic and political revolution, that she did not understand them to be private acts of devotion. She found the kind of charity that is covering up injustice to be disgusting. That's not a good use of the word Christian charity, but when we talk about charity as just giving a gift so that somebody will go away and not be a problem to me anymore, that she found that absolutely abhorrent. You want to understand what the systems are that are causing people to be in poverty and be changing those. But the other side of her work was not just the kind of immediately addressing bad wages and lack of access to food, but the other kind of works of mercy, admonishing the sinner and instructing the ignorant. And, I worry sometimes, that thing everybody likes to say, proclaim the gospel, if necessary, use words. And I get the point. You can talk too much. You can certainly talk cheaply, and that's a bad thing if you're talking something and you're not living it. It's not going to be very effective and may counteract what you're trying to do. But you know, part of what was important about Dorothy Day was that she said things. She would name the injustice, and she would confront people about the injustice they were committing, not necessarily assuming that they're demonic and they're evil, but in many cases, these are brothers and sisters in Christ who are doing these things. But confronting them, giving them reasons, showing them where the mistake is, I think we hold back from that. Dorothy Day lived in the middle of a lot of conflict, and she was very controversial because what she was doing was practicing that side of the works of mercy, right? Instructing the ignorant and admonishing the sinner. So I think that there's something about holding those two things together that's very important. So on the one hand, she's continually practicing herself mercy and compassion and patience so that she's not going to be consumed by that kind of anger. And on the other hand, she's going to speak the truth. I mean, I actually think if we wanted to say what's Dorothy Day's charism, I would call her an evangelist. I think the newspaper is certainly a kind of evangelism that she was engaged in. And what they meant to be doing by the House of Hospitality. You know, there's a story, Dorothy and Peter, one day they're in the house and it's a wreck and things are going badly and everybody's angry at each other and Dorothy looks at Peter and says, "Is this really what you had in mind?" And there was a long pause, and then Peter said, "At least it rouses the conscience." Right? Setting the example, even if it's not perfect, setting the example that can indicate to people, I don't accept the way things are. I expect things to be different. I'm giving my life to trying to make things be different. And you can do that too. I think providing that message, speaking that message to each other is a part of our calling that we need to get more comfortable with. Peter had this practice, a good practice of getting people around a table and listening to each other, hearing each other out. So this isn't just about, come and try to shut somebody down by out-shouting them. This is also not going to help. But engaging in real frank conversations about what we understand the gospel to require, I think that's an important thing that we have to practice, that we have to find our way into. Without hatred. Keeping in mind this personalist revolution, right? That the person you're arguing with is also this precious, beloved soul of God who has depths of wisdom and gifts to give, which can be very, as I know well, can be very hard to keep in mind in an argument. But that's part of the practice, too, of personalism. Any other thoughts? Well, thank you. This has been a really great time for me to get my head back around Dorothy Day. I think there are a lot of gifts in her life and in her writing, and I hope that this introduction intrigues you. Oh, I was going to put in one more plug. If you were interested in the stuff I was saying last week, this is the book that I got all of that from. Ben Peters, who got his PhD at the University of Dayton, thank you very much, wrote a book on Dorothy Day and John Hugo's influence on her. So if you're looking for something to read that's got a little substance to it about Dorothy Day's spirituality, this is a really good one. So anyway, thank you. This has been a joy.
So let me conclude the first part of Vibing with the Venerables. We have 4 people, and we conclude with Dorothy Day, the first part of it. I want to thank Kelly Johnson for truly a spectacular, really, presentation. I learned so much. I was supposed to begin the series, but we switched dates, and it's because Kelly is having hip surgery in the coming week. So I'm inviting all of you who are watching and who are in church here to please keep her in your prayers. I just anointed her before the talk began, so please be assured that will be in our prayers. Her surgery is on the 14th, so please keep her in your prayers. I was thinking, Catholicism, like the Gospels, has so much to offer to the world. And I think, as I was sitting there and listening to Kelly, I think we've lost the sense of what Catholicism has to offer to the world. And part of the reason is that as Catholics, we lose the sense of who we are, and then buy hook, line, and sinker into either models of economy or social existence that really doesn't gel with what the gospel of Catholicism stands for. And what Dorothy Day and Peter Morin wake us up to is that Catholicism is not just practicing religion, it's a lifestyle. And I think these kind of talks bring out the Catholic in us and the difference that we can make into the way the world exists today. So that's one thing. Then I was just it just hit me at one point that, oh gosh, this is like Teresa of Lisieux, because I did a 6-week series on her, and then Kelly puts her picture up on the screen just before, but 5 seconds before you put the picture, just thinking, oh my gosh, this is just exactly. Sometimes I feel very insignificant, but yet in that insignificance is greatness, and that was Teresa of Lisieux, that moment of serendipity where she says, "My vocation is love." And I think it's that about Dorothy Day. My vocation is love. So next week we will begin with my segment of this talk on Archbishop Oscar Romero. Again, very much controversial, and yet been declared a saint in the church. So for the next 2 weeks, join me at 7 o'clock every Friday, for the next 2 Fridays, to talk about Saint Oscar Romero. See you then. Good night and God bless.